All right. So we spoke last that this was going to be a three-part series. In the last video, we covered tariffs, free trade. What do they mean? How do they play out? Just the simple and basic understanding of how taxes work, how governments may use some of these things in the marketplace, blah, blah, blah. And the two other elements that we really need to cover are basically China, which is the our target in this quote-unquote trade war, and us, ourselves. What do we know about the history of the U.S., our strengths, our weaknesses, etc.? I'm going to take this out of step and start actually with part 3 right now, because I'm going to do a little bit of a dive in the U.S. historical outlook towards trade, towards the war, what role we've played in the world, what happened after World War II, what happened all the way through to today. And then we'll dive into China afterwards. So, although I'm a big fan of the United States, a lot of our advantages were basically roll of the dice. It happens to be a very large continent, very well stocked, very well isolated, very well defended, or at least defensible. Not only that, it contains a significant amount of arable land. I mean, it's pretty much flat for most of the country. It has a fundamentally stable climate, not a whole lot of variation in terms of desertification or hard shifts in terms of like desertification, like the way Egypt, for example, went from the breadbasket of the world to desert overnight, or the Gobi Desert, or things of that nature. So we've never really had much in terms of radical shift effects. And you can pretty much count, and there's only like 2-3 other areas in the world that can pretty much consider themselves a climate safe area, an area where climate, regardless of major catastrophe, it is most likely to retain its fundamental accessibility to arable land. Like, so for example, if you sort of think about the tilt of the Earth shifting just slightly, for example, and the sun basically shifting its proportion of heat that a certain area absorbs. In America, it's so large and so flat that while it may shift some of the crops we may have to put in a given location, it would just make that much, some land that was previously unarable will now make it fertile and dry something that was, or at least change crops in an area that was once more amenable to certain other ones. So in effect, we're likely to retain or even gain significant arable land for the foreseeable future. On top of that, we've got the largest network of navigable waterways, so rivers specifically. We're not concerned necessarily with oceans, although obviously that's critical for trade. But for an internal economy to be thriving, you need to be able to get stuff from A to B. So it's awesome if your land is flat and you can put trains across it. We've done that. But it's really awesome if you have a whole lot of rivers, because it's a lot cheaper to just float stuff from A to B. And between the greater Mississippi River and all of the tributaries that flow into it or flow away to sea, we're pretty well covered in terms of being able to rapidly move minerals, oil, textiles, whatever we want from A to B. We actually have more than the entire rest of the world put together in terms of internal navigable waterways. And it's, as I said, fairly optimized for transport. We also have tons of mineral resources, almost everything you need, with maybe the exception of the odd rare earth metal. And because we were basically colonizers, we were the ones that were looking for opportunities. So fundamentally, a lot more orientation towards middle class values, if you would. The workers, the ones that are not ashamed to roll a sleeve up and get to work. I mean, there were some landed gentry that came along here and there, but by and large, this was not, the aristocracy was not something we transplanted with us. And most importantly, I think and this is a point that often gets missed. We often get accused of being, imperialistic. We were the colony. We fought the empire. We are very much not we are the colonized, if you would, mentality. We fought against the central power calling the shots from far away. So it isn't in our mindset necessarily to have at least the traditional hegemonic outlook of empire. We want to make sure that we hold influence, we hold sway, but we don't necessarily look to conquer. Most importantly, we're the place where the first revolution took place, and arguably the only one that worked, because as much as the French Revolution that followed ours is very, very famous, liberté, égalité, and all that shit, that didn't last. We're still basically working off the proceeds of ours. We haven't overturned it yet. So you'll often hear America being referred to as the experiment, meaning the first experiment in self-governance, where man can rule himself and does not require divine intervention or divine right, or etc., etc. So that's America. We got a pretty good starting hand, if you would. So now let's fast forward to like the end of World War II. So at this point, there's been two wars that for both we showed up fashionably late. Now keep in mind, World War I was so brutal and so mechanized, it completely shattered any imagination limits that we had in terms of how much damage we could cause to each other. And this is nothing to take lightly, because Napoleonic Wars were the very first time where Napoleon basically showed that he can afford to like kill off 30,000 people a day and have people continuously refilling his armies. These types of conflict, these large numbers, these large engagements were just not even possible in the earth for until the late 1800s. And then come the 1900s, add to that full industrialization, mechanization, and artillery and tanks and chemicals and all of the wonders of violent war, and most of Europe is shell shocked once they exit World War I, and no sooner do they get enmeshed in World War II, along with a whole bunch of radical ideologies taking hold, like in Russia and everywhere else. So now you've got just horrible ideas taking root in governments and mass murder on a scale previously not even imagined. So obviously, lots of death, lots of destruction. And of course, because we were fashionably late, we were able to apply our pressure with the most effect. So come the end, we again are able to be amongst the victorious. But after World War II, we actually find ourselves in a very unique position of being the last man standing. We've got the only functional navy. I mean, you can say that Britain and the rest of our allies may have, a ship here, a ship there, but fundamentally, we have carriers, we have destroyers, we have sunk everyone else's, most importantly. We also have the only untouched economy. I mean, there really hasn't been any violence in the homeland, and the homeland is huge, and it's a huge market. So we find ourselves as being the key player in establishing what the world should look like from then on. That's a big deal. So what do? Well, we get everybody in a room and we say what we want, and we try to convince them to our side. What do we want? We want Soviet containment. This is the most important thing that I think we need to keep in mind. Today's world trade and the world order under which it functioned was never about trade or commerce for us. It was always about security. What we wanted was Soviet containment. We knew that the communism was a problem, even though we eventually allied with communists. We knew that they were going to continue to grow. We knew that they were going to be a threat. So we wanted to make sure that we get as many people on side as possible so we can contain what we saw as the red threat. Now, what did we offer? Well, we said, look, first and foremost, we will secure the world's waterways and everything else. We are going to ensure that you have the ability to trade freely, so go acquire any raw material from any location, ingest it into your own economy, turn it into some sort of value-added good, and then go sell it anywhere else you like without interference. Most importantly, we put money in, so we offered up our markets as being, as we offered up our markets completely open, no tariffs. You can now rebuild your economy by selling us whatever it is that you produce. And if you're having trouble producing it, we'll even lend you money to get you started. And the Marshall Plan had a tremendous effect. I mean, it allowed, within the next 15 years, the bulk of Europe was able to recover to previous strength or better. I mean, this is the reason we have an EU today, is the Marshall Plan. All you had to do is pick a side. And we weren't picky. I mean, we even took, as we'll get into the topic of China, we actually sort of decided to look the other way about their communist leanings. As long as we had them in some sort of agreement, we were happy. So 1945, we're basically the world's creditor. We are the creditor nation. Everybody else has lost everything. Whatever gold reserves they had, they even decided to park them in our Fort Knox, because they didn't know if they were going to win the war after all. So we're sitting pretty. And now remember, we also had we were the only ones with nukes at this point. It wasn't until the 50s that the Russians figured theirs out. So at the same time, this Bretton Woods agreement was taking place. And keep in mind that we were aware as a nation that there was this heavy communist/socialist influence within our, that had infiltrated our government, had infiltrated our education. If the U.S. has a weakness, it's basically that which is its greatest strength. This idea that all voices are free to be heard. So the unfortunate part of this is that we've never really been good at suppression or at holding at bay the more reactionary ideologies. So when socialists came and they were accepted in Harvard and they became faculty, we kind of just grumbled about it. We tried some various hearings and some laws, but fundamentally, our Constitution allows it. So they were allowed to go and preach their vile ideas into our society. So at least at this time, we understood that Bretton Woods was the agreement. So this was primarily handled by the more, let's say, conservative military, let's say the more old school amongst our government. And plus there was plus Keynes and White, I think, were two socialists that we had to accept there. But most of the socialists, we shoved them over to create the international orgs. And they did. They created the UN, the WTO, the IMF. You see now how the different executions varied over time. What the UN does and their approach and their empowerment versus, what trade policy and our military do in terms of shaping the world. But fundamentally, to summarize all this stuff, we basically started our now long-standing policy of foreign aid. We were going to be the checkbook, and we were going to write a check for every friend we were going to be able to buy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's not necessarily sustainable, and that's not necessarily a long-term good thing. So thus was launched what will become known as Pax Americana. Much like the Romans had Pax Romana because they kept the roads clear and safe, and merchants could travel unmolested, it's that, but with ships. We did it so well, however, that a bunch of countries could just go ahead and skip their entire military investments and instead take that money and pump it into their economies, which they did. So here's the world after Bretton Woods. The Reds are the Reds, the Soviets. Notice the nice brown buffer line here? We bribed a bunch of countries to just make sure that we've got them a little bit contained there. Bribe China, try to get on side with the majority of Southeast Asia, pieces of Africa, and of course the Persian Gulf. And then closer to home, we had our core allies and we had the original members, the allies or the capitalists, if you would, with some some infection, of communism or socialism here and there. But by and large, things were good. And again, we were the only one was with nukes, so that made a difference. Now, let's open up this period of time between the late 40s, early 50s, and say, I don't know, let's like say into George Bush Senior time. What did that mean to the world? Why was travel, why was maritime travel so important? Well, look at China. And I know this is a little tilted, so adjust your head just so. But notice how this orange and red stuff means need oil, and the orange and green stuff means have oil. Notice how conveniently far apart they are from each other. Now, there's some oil there's some oil pipelines from Russia, but Russia and China don't really get along that great. There's some natural gas, and again, they don't really get along that great. They don't want to be too dependent on each other. So what China and Japan and most of Southeast Asia and a bunch of others, they rely on schlepping their ships across, going through the Straits of Malacca and all the way into the Persian Gulfs, into the Straits of Hormuz, go to the Iranians or to the Saudis, park in one of their loading infrastructures, pump billions of gallons into a tanker, and then start schlepping it back all the way. Now, it's really easy to do this if you've got, say, carrier battle groups, the type the United States has, parked every so many miles, if you would, along the road. If this was, let's say, without a policeman, well, then you'd better have a navy to escort all of these ships. And mind you, this is not just oil is one of the, obviously, the lifeline imports for China and for almost any other developed economy. But this is also the lifeline for trade. This is how you make your money. Anything you make as a good, well, you're schlepping it across the same way. Maybe you don't take it to the Persian Gulf, but then you definitely take it out to other locations or to Europe, etc. So I'm focusing on China because obviously this is within the context of China, and we'll go back into it in part 2, 3. But China by itself is also hemmed in, if you notice. It's got access to ocean, right? But not direct ocean. It has basically the Sea of Japan, the South China Sea. There's all these archipelagos that get in the way. Japan isn't exactly a slouch. Notice how this line is the most efficient travel for oil, but for Japan there is a second option. It is far longer. Instead of 7,000 miles, like 12,000 miles, so 40% lengthier. But China has, let's say, sufficient navy to maybe protect itself here. Japan has sufficiently advanced military capabilities that they can interdict, and they don't have to play here. They can lob missiles and screw this whole area up if they feel like it, right? Which puts them in a very distinctly different position. Now, not to say that Japan and China will be going at each other, but should the dice go the wrong way, Japan can still get by because it can go around. Now, let's say they don't get in a shooting war. If these two guys get in a shooting war, and we'll cover that in a bit, holy crap, then everybody, they had to look out for themselves and need to escort every one of their ships. So this is a problem. This is a major problem. Now, there's some oil, very little. And notice the little pink lines. And it's basically, it requires a whole lot of offshore drilling. And there's a lot of arguments about who owns what. But this oil is nowhere near sufficient for the demand that China has. So let's just look specifically. The beautiful thing about the Persian Gulf, aside from the continuous peace and harmony that they've offered to the world, is that you go through the Gulf of Oman, you go through these tiny straits here, which it makes it really easy to get shot at from land, even if they don't have major ships. And then you go here and you get to pick a side. You're either going to go to the Saudis, right, or Kuwaitis, right, and load up oil from there, or you're going to go to the Iranians, load up oil from there. Either way, pick a side. Let's hope that these two sides are not going at it, right? Because then you got to park, go right back out, whoops, and then either head out through the Gulf of Oman and go into Asia, or go around, go through the Straits of Hormuz and the Suez, go through the Straits of Hormuz, go through the Suez, the Egyptian Channel, and then get out to Europe. That's still kind of a long trek. Incidentally, just had an Iranian ship loaded with oil blow up right here. They had made it all the way out, and then they got shot at. So it was a problem. They're starting some crap over that now. But here's the problem. If you're South Korea, China, Japan, Taiwan, a disruption is severe. Severe. You would basically be majority disrupted, because a disruption would account for the bulk of your oil. You would have some choice, some trickles, if you notice, 49, 31 million barrels, 76 million barrels, not the large numbers you need, but some of it would be able to come in from basically West Africa. So, all the various oil deposits that Africa has, Angola, Congo, etc. But it's not nearly the heavy arrows that you need to fuel your economy. So you need to keep that oil supply going. And so how have we kept this? Well, with these things. This is basically a super carrier. Britain has built one, or is in the process of building one, and I think a second one on order. But fundamentally, most nations have what are called jump carriers, not super carriers. These things have basically it's a floating army, and they usually come in battle groups, which means they are accompanied by destroyers, by cruisers, by PT boats, by a variety of water engaging type craft, a pile of aircraft, and the occasional submarine spotter, etc. Now, let's kind of put this in perspective. The U.S. has 12 of these, and the Queen Elizabeth is the closest in size. So the Gerald Ford, which is the Nimitz class, or the super class, the super carrier class, it's basically around 100,000 tons. The QE is the very most modern, closest to super carrier that anybody that's not the U.S. has. And that's 65, so that's 60% of its size. Then you're talking about jump carriers, right? Similar to that size are the Russian carriers, the Kuznetsov class. Interesting to remember, they built 4 of these. One of them had some issues, got its bow broke, and it had to be chopped up. One was sold to India, one was sold to China, one is still in Russian hands. Technically, as they were building one of the Kuznetsov, a Chinese or a Macau millionaire basically expressed interest in just buying the superstructure because he was going to make the world's largest floating casino. So they sold it to him because they were. This was as the Cold War was collapsing. This is Yeltsin days, and then China basically seized it from the Macau millionaire, and then decided to refit it back to its full glory as a carrier. That is China's sole carrier, only one they got. India has got the other one. Russia's got the other one. It's a good carrier, but remember that when they came into Syria, they brought that carrier from from Black Sea and past Turkey, etc. They had more planes get killed by that carrier because of it's very small. It has issues with its catapults and all that stuff. It's not really the robust carrier one might think when they think in terms of American carriers. So very quickly they had to get landed in they had to get bases of actual land and started conducting their operations from there. So while the carrier was in the Gulf, yes it was, or in the vicinity of Syria, it really wasn't the point of deployment. Majority of our deployments can happily happen off the carrier all day long. Each carrier carries about 5,000 people and a full complement of other ships, like I said. And here's where we park them. We have this, I was showing in the previous maps, there's this little place called Diego Garcia. And then there's Guam. So obviously we park a whole lot of them around either side of our country. Then we've got this little sort of halfway spot, so we can either jump over to Europe if there's a need, right, or jump through through all the way to the internal Mediterranean, come out here if there's this side of the Middle East that we need to attack, And then we have, again, Diego Garcia here, which is happily located very close to the Gulf of Oman and the Red Sea. So between us covering here, or in Guam, being able to cover Japan, China, Southeast Asia, etc., we tend to have some carrier group within an hour or two of any possible incident. In fact, when China decided to sort of flex some muscles and threaten Taiwan, we just very gently took our carrier base, our carrier group, and from where it was, and we just sort of floated it, and close to Taiwan, and they pretty much stopped. They didn't like it. We've been penalized in our relationships for that little move ever since, but they do project power, and this is, by and large, how trade happens in the world. Period. Take these guys away, and trade gets really funky. Now, how funky? Well, before we had a carrier in the Persian Gulf, because remember, we weren't all that crazy about the Middle East till a few years down the line. Come World War II, Cold War, all that stuff, Middle East wasn't that sparky. But here's the story of the Seawise Giant. To give you an idea, this here is one of them big carriers that we have, right? There's a Soviet Typhoon submarine, if you would. The QE-2 liner. Well, this was the largest ship ever built. This was the Seawise Giant. And if you see it laid on its side, it was, taller than the Eiffel Tower. It was nearly as tall as the Sears Tower. Pretty damn big. What happened to it? It was built in 1979 by Sumitomo. It went through some issues in terms of speccing, and the Greek shipper that ordered it thought it had some problems, canceled on the order, blah, blah, blah. But they did sell it eventually. Had 4 million barrel capacity. It was drafting so deep. Drafting meaning, notice how it's high when it doesn't have oil. Notice how deep it goes when it does. Right? It drafted so deep that it couldn't cross the English Channel. It would scrape on the bottom. Its top speed was 9 kilometer. It was 16 knots. It took 9 kilometers to come to a stop, and it took a 3 kilometer radius to turn. Gives you an idea of just how sprightly these behemoths are. But it's important to remember it's 4 million barrel capacity, right? When a barrel is $100, that's a lot of money. 400 million, right there, right? If it goes over $100, you're talking about $500 million sitting in the hold of one ship. And in 1988, there was a shooting war between Iran and Iraq. You might remember from Ollie North and the Contra deal that Iran and Iraq were going at each other's throats, and we happened to like Iraq back then, and we would feed them weapons. And so this thing was passing along. Mind you, it wasn't a Iranian ship or an Iraqi ship. At the time, it was basically a Norwegian ship, I think. And anyways, it wasn't in either of the participants of the war, and it got sunk. Boom, went to the bottom. Here's a picture of it as it went down. Now, surprisingly, it didn't take long for America to get their shit together, and all of a sudden carrier groups became more of a permanent thing. And it really didn't take long for this huge behemoth to be refloated, because guess what? When you sink $500 million worth of oil, people get interested on how to salvage that really fast, especially a ship. Now, I don't know what the final price of the ship was. I just know in one of its resales, it sold for like $16 million, so it wasn't terribly expensive. But when you got $500 million of oil in your hold, yeah, you get floated back up. So it was salvaged, brought back up, now renamed the Happy Giant. It was sold to either Sweden or Finland. It was renamed the Yare Viking, and was sold to yet another Norwegian trader, and it was named the Knock Nevis. And then eventually it was sold to India to be chopped up. It was called the Mont, and that was in 2009. So it was called the Mont as it sailed away, parked itself off the coast of India, and got chopped up. Now, these things are so huge, they're obviously not maneuverable. Often they function as just floating platforms for storage. There's a lot of these. Here's a current view of just trade ships. This is just the tiny little island of Singapore, which happens to be an international hub for Asia. Now, this is just the real-time traffic view in a given day, to give you an idea. If all of a sudden shooting your enemy's boats was okay, just imagine how much more empty these sea lanes would be. Now, again, we keep all these things clear by these carrier groups. China doesn't have carrier groups. But what do they have? Well, they have the South China Sea, which they've always felt a little bit raw about us being able to kind of just cruise up through there like we own the place. So little by little, in these orange spots, they started making claims as to the sovereignty of that water. And they made a claim by basically saying, no, see those rocks there, that's actually an island that we have a claim to. And when the rocks were not big enough, they would just basically start dumping ship after ship of sand and made it into bigger and bigger islands. To the point where now these little spots are able to function as fundamental air bases, aka stationary carriers, in the South China Sea. Because they felt that if they can secure this little corner, they can at least be more secure that they wouldn't be as vulnerable to interrupted trade, etc., etc. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily make the Philippines happy. It doesn't make Taiwan happy. It doesn't make Thailand happy, Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia. And of course, not too far from here is India, who is basically about the same number of people and also nuclear. And of course, Guam is not. There's a little speck here. That's got a whole bunch of carriers waiting just to go there. So that's where we stand now with the global situation of who's ruling the seas, who would like to rule the seas. Now, the reason I said I want to stretch it to sort of George Sr.'s time is that throughout this time, we had a very clear goal. We want to contain the Soviets. And then when Gorbachev came on the scene, we won. So we never kind of revisited the reasons why we had the world organized the way that we do. So keep that in mind. Our reason for containing the Soviets goes away. Now let's look at the second thing that's important in a country's relative bid for power. Demographics. Now, population is basically the main resource that a country has. It's both an asset and a liability. Obviously, it's an asset because that's your labor force, that's your military force. To the degree that you have cultural unity, then you have solidarity, you have a united country, you're able to stand off many enemies. It can be a liability. It's a lot of mouths to feed. If you don't have sufficient resources, they become a real drag real quick and they turn on you. The population mix can also be unfavorable for what you need. You could have too many old people, too many young people. You could have too many of the wrong sex and not enough of the other sex. You could also have multiple ethnic backgrounds that didn't mesh well. Some of the challenges we saw in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union was that, in the case of Kosovo and all these other places, Yugoslavia had a strong man holding it together. There was no ethnic conflict up until there was no longer any sort of strong man to beat everybody else down. Then everybody reignited their age-old feuds. This kind of stuff happens. We see it happen all over the world. Middle East was like that. Iraq, Iran, Europe wasn't immune to it. So we're gonna see this over and over and over. Population is also extremely sensitive because what do you need? You need your birth rate to be a functional replacement rate. People have kids for a variety of reasons, right? The rate of kids you have changes drastically based on a variety of things. Obviously, back in the day, medical science wasn't what it was supposed to be, so half the kids you ever gave birth to died, or didn't make it, to the point where you could even give them a name. The wealthier you get, there's sort of a norm that gets established depending on the culture you're in, right? So if you're in America and most places in Western Europe or frankly most urban locations, if everybody around you has 2 kids, you're going to have 2 kids. If you're at the farm, you don't think twice about having, 10 kids, because kids are an asset in that, they're your labor force. You need them, and they're going to take care of you in your old days. But that's usually, subsistence farming, more sort of poverty type societies. The better the society, the less kids they tend to have. Now, obviously, population can also be severely disrupted by disease, by conflict, by civil unrest. And then there's the more perfidious one, which is culture and subversion. Now, you look at America, Christian values, sort of middle class type of people, lots of farmers. Small farmers used to be the sort of lifeblood of the middle country. You needed lots of kids. You had the type of culture that lent itself to large families and community living, et cetera, et cetera. Start moving to New York, and all of a sudden, you don't necessarily see many families that have 10 kids. You do if they're immigrants, but not if they're natives. All of a sudden, launch the sexual revolution and the hippie movement and the bra burning and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, women are told, having a kid isn't all it's cracked up to be. You should go get a job, and you should go, have free sex, and not forget family. Family's so passé. That becomes not just an activism pushed agenda, but also becomes a normal societal trend. You want to be a young woman. All of a sudden, both men and women want to continue their adolescence well into late college. And of course, they are activists. You've got environmentalism, you've got feminism, you got LGBTQ. Now, what do all these things have in common? Every one of those movements reduces functional birth rate. Gay guys don't have a lot of kids. They may adopt, but they don't crank them out. Feminists tend to kind of look on motherhood like it's a plague. And environmentalists don't want to replace themselves because, God forbid, we might kill the whales. All of those things take a drag on your population. And if you run out of people, you're fucked. Now, of course, you can compensate for some of this with immigration. But you never know what you're going to get. America happens to be extremely healthy in this. We legally import about 1 million a year, and we've done probably the worst, the least worst or the best or whatever you want to call it. We've done the most serviceable job of integration of multiculturals of any country that I can think of. The only other place where I would see a better integration or just at the same level of integration might be just a city, London specifically. Aside from that, I can't really think of entire countries where integration has worked. Angela Merkel tried it, and the migration crisis really hasn't gone well for them. But, okay, so now, keeping that in mind, here's some pictures of various countries. Now, this is the typical picture you'll see in, let's say, a growing economy, where basically every generation has more kids as they go. So there's more people replacing the last line of people before them. That gives you a nice full stream of labor force, creative ideas, investment, people. You're replacing and you're growing. Growing is good. Let's kind of carve out, I'm picking on Mexico, but let's also think about what we're looking at. Up to 18, you're a kid. You require being invested in. You need your health, you need your education, you need socialization, education, blah, blah, blah. You participate in culture, but you don't participate in politics. You're not young enough. You're not old enough to vote. You don't really hold a job. You're not really making you don't have an active role in society. You may have a voice, but you don't have a vote. Now, past 18 until about, 40s, you're the young and the middle age. This is where you launch yourself on a career, you begin to build a family. You're all about spend. Now you're earning money, you're growing your earning potential, but you're also spending it like it's out of fashion. Because you need to spend on kids and on a house and on, cars and whatever. Every single thing that you need to establish your life with. You have a voting role, you have a role in governance, in politics. And you also have a fundamental role in culture. Increasingly, we see that role. So this is the most shape. You'd be able to shape culture, not so much politics, but shape culture along with the younger generation. Now you move into the 45 to 65. These are the near retirement, right? These are the wise people. They are basically they have reached or are about to reach their peak earning potential. They're not spending anymore. They've gotten it. They've paid off their house. They've paid off their cars. They've booked their kids for college. They're looking for investment. Their money is going straight into investments. They're looking for every possible investment idea because they know they're going to be retiring, and at that point they're going to need to collect on those investments. They have an extremely strong political voice, and they have some cultural voice, but fundamentally, no. Who cares what 45 or 65-year-olds think about culture, right? And then you got the 66 till wherever you die. These guys they're not making any money. They're not investing in anything. If anything, they're divesting, right? So they're spending their retirement monies. Hopefully they have some. And they're very focused on maintaining their rights. So they'll fight any sort of legislation that seeks to strip them of their rights because they don't feel like moving back in with their children. So the problem is that various countries have had different tranches of all of these groups. So they have left the performance of each country in a different state. In the US, you might hear about the baby boomers and how really they've displaced every single generation since because they were so large. You've heard about the Great Generation, which are the folks that actually fought in World War II. The baby boomers was the result of the Great Generation coming home and getting freaky. Then after the baby boomers came the Gen Xers, sort of the yuppies. Not quite. The boomers turned into hippies, then their kids turned into yuppies. Then you had sort of Gen Y, Gen Z, millennial, that whole tranche, and those are basically the current generation that's shaping society. Every one of these guys had a very different impact on society, and we'll go through that. And they didn't all happen in the same numbers in the same countries because remember, there was a lot of upheaval going on. So here's one of the worst cases of an overdeveloped economy. So take Japan. Japan basically, well, they had World War II, and before World War II, they had been involved in a long, protracted conflict with a variety of Asian countries, most of which was China, so the Sino-Japanese War. Japan was a little bit quicker on the uptake, if you would, than the Chinese, because if you go back, I mean, obviously they've always had a very disciplined and ordered society. That's a native trait of Japan. But they've watched China go through its century of humiliation, and I'll discuss that in the next video. But they had always looked up to China. I mean, this was the Middle Kingdom, the large, mother country, if you would. But saw them embrace a policy of isolation, and then how that cost them because they fell so far behind in terms of weaponry, military strength, all that stuff. And that's exactly what Japan had done. To basically, they had followed suit. When China closed its doors, it closed its doors. The Edo period, basically, you were more likely to get your head chopped off if you landed on Japanese soil. But they very quickly caught on and realized that if it leaves China this week, we better get with the program. So they launched the Meiji Restoration. And then, of course, that led into World War II. But here's the strange thing now. When you take a highly ordered society that have an emperor, which they see as basically the designate of God, you accept orders from on high. The Meiji Restoration took a whole bunch of what was a feudal world and said, you will industrialize now. You will invest in these things. You will give it your all because that's your duty to the motherland, or whatever they call the country. State-directed development, not socialism, strangely enough, right? If anything, I guess monarchism. But between war priorities and Meiji Restoration, these guys basically went to work. They put it all in. They lost the war, but that really didn't. I mean, okay, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, bad days. No backing away from that one. But by and large, if you really think about it, once all of that stuff blows over, here comes America, parks a shitload of its staff on permanent base in whatever, all over Japan, and then starts dumping money into your economy, and you no longer are even allowed to have an army, right? Not only do you need one, you're not even allowed to have one. So the Japanese don't miss a beat. They were already on a set of marching orders between Meiji Restoration and World War II to basically grow technologically. I mean, the naval advancements, the aeronautics advancements, the automobile advancements that they already undergone were major. So what did they do? They started making cars. They started making electronics. They started making everything. Huge, huge boom, right? Artificial stimulus, because, here's a bunch of American money, and you're taking all of the money you would have spent on the military and parking those into economic development. So they became very, very successful. Now, at the same time, when you've pushed so much of your focus in your life into work, it begins to take a toll. So all of a sudden, values, family values tend to get a little shifty. You've got the concept of salaryman. The head of household goes to work, works at a minimum 12 hours, sometimes more. Highly estranged from his spouse. The spouse is basically in charge of the house, and really doesn't see him, doesn't hardly see him, because he'll show up, basically crash, maybe, fumble around in the bedroom for a bit, unless he's just too exhausted, and then immediately right back at work. And in fact, it has gotten so repeated and so clockwork that if they even want sex, the housewife tends to go to these Nampa hotels where they pick up some random strangers and they get a quick roll in the hay, as does the salaryman. So they no longer connect on a family level. In fact, once he gets his pension and retires, it's his sort of expected role to bring the cash home, put a nice suit on, and walk over to the suicide forest and blow his brains out, because he has no means, no way, no understanding of how to interact with a family. And frankly, if he's not working, he's basically the equivalent of a bag of trash to the wife. And I'm not exaggerating. This is the exact outlook. So work, success, 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 and all of a sudden you've got this issue where people start disconnected. They're not making enough kids, which means they're not making enough labor force. And mind you, not enough labor and expertise. And this is Japan, right? Hell of smart, hell of high tech. This is why they're the leader in automation. Because, when you don't have people, you make robots. And the beautiful thing with robots is, you don't have to have them in your country. So you can start moving entire swaths of your industry and co-locate them where it's safe, like, say, in the US. But every single generation in the last 2 or 3 grew up knowing that they were never going to be able to match their parents' level of economic success. So imagine what a great morale booster that is, right? So all of these little tranches who are not going to be replacing these other bigger tranches, notice it's a downward spiral. Now, this is not to say that the society will be over. They may well, coast with their robots all through. But this is where success bites you in the ass. So that's one type of country. Here's a whole other type of country. Russia. Russia took the brunt of World War II. We as a nation lost maybe 400,000 people. The Germans, because obviously at the end they were the target of the unified assault by everybody, and obviously they were the ones that had put the armies in the field to begin with. Between civilians and army, they lost somewhere around 50, 60 million. Russia basically matched them in their loss. That was one country. They had so many people that when they had engaged, when they were sending the armies into battle, they found that they had not enough equipment. So one soldier would get given a strip of 5 bullets, one soldier would be given a rifle with no bullets. Whoever got shot first got to pick up the other guy's kit and make a complete set. And this may sound like a made-up story, but unfortunately it was not. Now, as America started pumping more and more weapons and cash and carry sort of investment over, they were able to make up for their shortages, but they basically buried the Nazis with people. They fought and lost and fought and lost and fought and lost. They had the highest casualties of any country. So, surprisingly, a lot of them were men. When you don't have a lot of guys, you don't end up making a lot of babies. So it started then. It started this male-female imbalance. Well, not only did you have World War II, but you had all of the kolkhozes, all of the Soviet movement, the communists, let's kill all the landowners, etc. So a whole bunch of bad planning causes a whole bunch of starvation on top of all of the lives lost. Guess what? You lose more men. And pretty soon you've got some complete disintegration of your numbers. Take on top of that the ideas that communism and socialism brings with the independent woman who can enter the proletariat, and all of a sudden families don't stay together anymore. So men basically, they work a lot like in Japan, but they're not as successful. So what they do when they get home, they don't just they're not motivated by the money that they're not earning. They're motivated by vodka. So they start developing all these pathological habits. Alcoholism is rampant. The few times that they tried to stop it, they end up, they try to kind of pull it back. They ended up having to fully reintroduce it because people would, if they couldn't get vodka, they would drink rubbing alcohol, methanol, any alcohol, even though it meant, large fatalities. So they pretty much had to keep a continuous supply of alcohol. With newer drugs beginning to come in from the various conflicts, all of a sudden you've got epidemics like heroin, crocodile, which is like dirt heroin. So there's a variety of pathological habits that basically keep the male average life expectancy, let's see, a good 14, 15 years lower than the women's. I mean, it ain't a few years. It's like goddamn, 10 to 15 years. Men die younger. So guess what that does? It fucks your population up. So now Russia's in a unique position. They've shed all of their little satellite states. Now, notice the Uzbekistan. Not great, but at least it was more like the traditional shape, right? Russia is all over the place. They got a problem. In 15 years, they will have exactly 50% of their military strength. That's no matter what they do, no matter if they draft, whatever, they will not be able to field hardly 50% of what they have today. Their military equipment had taken a hit after the collapse of, when Yeltsin decided to have a fire sale with Russian assets. Putin has done his best to recover the economy, and he has absolutely done a phenomenal job in taking the economy up. But he's based on this one key thing. He exports oil or natural gas. When $60 a barrel oil is okay, he's okay with the economy. If it drops a little bit, but Germany picks up some extra natural gas, he's okay. But if it starts dropping to, I don't know, say below 40, he's got a bad economy. Then all of a sudden unrest happens all over again. Also, the most educated technical generation, the cohort with tech training, the ones that built the bombs and the planes and all that, they're 51 now. The youngsters aren't getting that same training. Some, to the degree that they're all about software and they're all about getting the hell out of Dodge from Russia. So not a lot of replacement expertise is coming in. So they're going to have a problem. Now, they've got Europe, and the way they took care of this historically, because everybody's invaded them, right? Even Canada at some point attacked Russia, by the way. The way they took care of this was they had their little buffer states, which had their own geography in place. So it really only needed them covering about 450 miles of border for their army. With their little strip of buffer states taken away and now joining NATO and parking missiles, they've got like 3,000 to 4,000 miles of open border, flat land, easily marchable. They got a problem. So at some point they're going to need to pull something. So they've talked about asymmetric weapons. They've talked about whatever. Something's going to pop off, and you're already seeing, the unrest with Ukraine. But I mean, who didn't see that coming? When they agreed that they were going to stop the Cold War, we told them, and the recording's still around, we will not move 1 inch closer to Russia, meaning NATO. And now fast forward, Putin's got every country that touches his border, not only, joining EU, joining NATO, but parking fucking missiles on his doorstep. So yeah, he's nervous. So when Ukraine was going through that shit, and all of a sudden Ukraine couldn't get a $1 billion loan, right? And then magically it decides that, oh, okay, we'll think about joining the EU, and the World Trade Organization magically gives them like $9 billion overnight, which, of course, if you've read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that's the typical debt trap. Putin was worried because if Ukraine fell into NATO and that took away Crimea, which was his only seaport on that side of the house, he wasn't going to be able to have a navy. So of course he re-annexed Crimea. I mean, hell, it has all the Russian speakers. Not even even Ukrainians could hardly make a claim that it was that Ukrainian. So I don't know that it surprised anyone. So for all the bullshit that Biden and Obama were posturing, they did nothing about that, and I'm not sure that even was our position to do anything. I mean, if you're going to basically keep pushing troops closer and closer to somebody's border, and then all of a sudden you're going to try to get them to lose their only local port, I think they're going to push back. But anyways, we're not on Russia's side on this one, so fuck them. Now, what's going on in the Persian Gulf? Well, notice again, some of the same issues, not as bad as Russia, but Iran. Now, Iran at least has the one claim to fame that it ain't just oil that they got. Saudi, they got sand and oil. They've gotten a little bit wiser now, so they've started slowly investing in their population, and they, put up solar panels because, if you run out of oil, there's still sun. But there will come a point where all of a sudden, if you can't sell your oil, if all of a sudden oil becomes less, say, desirable, you're fucked. And your main competitor hates you and you hate them. There's eons of conflict. They're both Muslim, but they're, Sunni Shia. They're sort of like the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants. They would like nothing better than to wipe the other country off the earth. And they keep poking at each other. So let's just say there's a good chance if the U.S. decides to get a little less involved, this will start a shooting war. I mean, hell, they're already shooting at each other today. How about EU? Well, here's the problem with EU. Notice how none of these countries are the right shape. I mean, Turkey, maybe. But Germany, Italy, Poland, Greece, Spain, all of them fairly financially fucked right now, by the way. The entire European experiment is basically, they're old. They often say, this is why every time you hear about an outlook of the world type of presentation, and it comes from Canada or Europe, everybody just takes it for granted that peace is a result of law. Everybody forgets that peace is a result of military strength. And they kind of talk down. I mean, this is what the interesting thing about Donald Trump. They all talked down to Trump that he wanted investment in NATO, and then he was holding them to all of these conditions. But not one of them realizes that, it's because of this country who really hasn't had a reason to keep investing as much as they have been investing. It is because of their efforts that you're able to live in a world where you can actually imagine war being bad. Because war used to be the everyday occurrence. It used to be the way you traded. You didn't trade with your neighbors. You went and shot at them and took their shit. So Europe is going to have some problems. UK wised up and at least is trying to get the heck out of Dodge, and hopefully they'll be successful. But they don't have the right mix of people growing. So they did like every good bureaucracy does. They try to import them. But that kind of blew up spectacularly. Because, all of a sudden you got all these places becoming the rape capital of the world, or, assaults are happening in plain daylight. Hungary, Poland, all of these have gone completely right-wing. They're not having any. And they're trying to do their best to deal with their shortages by basically injecting bonuses in the economy, the exact opposite of the one-child policy that Mao was doing. They'll give families incentives to have more children. But again, that doesn't work really well, because you have more children because you want more children. If you're living in the city and your friends have 2 kids, you're going to have 2 kids. You're not going to have 5. So unless they can basically figure out how to repartition the demographics and push people out of the urban areas back into more rural areas, I don't see that population growth is going to be on anybody's agenda. Which, hey, on the bright side, means population worldwide is going to be on the mend. And good old China. China, in 1990, you could hardly see that they might have a problem. By 2015, it was obvious, and now it's projected to look something like this. Now, not only does it have a huge population issue, it has a concentration issue, it has a sex imbalance issue, and it has basically one of the worst, the one-child policy. A lot of this data that I'm showing here is, by the way, from a gentleman by the name of Peter Zehan, who does an amazing outlook of geopolitics. But his joke is that, it takes 25 years to raise 25-year-olds. So the Chinese aren't nearly as good at math as they would have us think, because 25 years later, after the one-child policy, they're running out of 25-year-olds. And here's the problem: it isn't that one child meant you could only have one child. It killed 400 million kids, because if you could only have one child and you were fundamentally a transitional agrarian country, you wanted a boy. So girls would get abandoned, left in the fields, or just literally tossed. 400 million kids were killed because they were undesired. They were either not a boy and they were first, or they were not first and they had to die. To give you an idea, I mean, China is the locale of one of the worst humanitarian disasters in history. However, when more and more boys were born, you now support your parents. And because the one-child policy had been around since Mao Zedong, you got a couple of generations of this. So your dad supports his parents. So now you've got basically the idea of 1, 2, 4. One boy supports 2 parents, 4 grandkids. And guess what? Chinese life has improved. Still being repressed, still under the boot heel of quasi-fascistic, socialistic, whatever. However, life expectancy has improved. So now you, as a young man, have nothing to look forward to in your life except watching your grandparents get older and older and older and still live along with your parents, all looking to you. Because guess what? There's no welfare in China. There's no social security in China. There's you. Now, when you recruit that young man in the army, you're recruiting the sole heir of 6 people. So how comfortable do you think the population is at allowing large-scale conflict fueled by Chinese soldiers when they're all the sole heir of the family? Just let that ruminate. So yeah, China's developing. But militarily, I wouldn't necessarily make them a world power just yet. And the other thing is, and we'll go into real depth in the following presentation, but most of it is smoke. They decided to recognize some very strange methods of counting GDP, and therefore they've got, to give you an idea, we got about 20 trillion in real GDP, and we have about 20 trillion in written down assets, like that constitute credit in our banking, like stuff that is borrowed against. They have about 16 on the real stuff, or whatever, the GDP stuff. And that's debatable because that's also done in their internal currency, the RMB, which has some purchasing power disparity, so it might be lower than that. But hey, the write-down assets, they're bordering 50 trillion. So that's not 3 times, that's almost 4 times. They don't issue any bad loans. You know why? Because they have a law against it. They just continue to carry loans. So imagine just the spectacular boom that this bubble will cause when it blows up. So yeah, China. Now, let's go to the US. Surprisingly, despite our best efforts, we managed not to fuck up our population pyramid. We've got our issues, but it looks like, they're being worked through, and by 2030, we're actually back on that, desirable kind of curve. More importantly, there's been a lot of development. So one was, the Soviet security issue just vaporizing. We no longer care. They're not a threat. We also don't much care about trade in general. I mean, we like it. We're okay with it, but we never depended on it. And the fact is, we've gotten we've grown a little tired of having to fucking help everybody only to get bitched at over and over and over. I mean, we are called everything from fascist to hegemonic to blah, blah, blah. We're the Satan of the world, and we're the only fucking country that ever helps anybody. Yet, you never hear you never hear sort of any gratitude, even from your close allies. I mean, most of Europe hates our guts. Why? Because we went over there to save their asses twice in a row, and are basically allowing them to run a horrendous fucking trade deficit at our expense. Yet, even fucking Canada, our next door neighbor, I mean, they basically like to talk down to us as if, what you guys need to do is more diversity and more Native Indian recognition. They expect us to be the shining beacon example for the world just because. And also to foot the bill for almost everything else they need. So, when you get somebody like Trump, that's been kind of a business guy most of his life, I mean, he's very comfortable asking the fundamental question, which is, what's in it for me? Because it sure fucking doesn't look like a lot. Now, as if it wasn't bad enough, here's the developing world if you just remove the U.S. Because the U.S. happens to be the one with all the youngsters. I mean, India's got some. India's got a lot. Mexico's got a bunch. But if you take the U.S. out, here's your world demography. Those mushrooms don't look good. Now, not just population, but there one other thing has happened, which is a doozy. Now, you might have heard about the strange case of them fossil fuels. Dinosaurs roamed the earth, they ate the plants, they died, they turned into jelly, and they eventually got liquefied into oil. That's one way to think about oil. It's possible. There's also another possibility. There's something called abiotic or abiogenic, which is it didn't come from biology. Because what's oil? Oil is basically hydrocarbons. When we distill plants, we call those carbohydrates. When we get it out of the dirt, we call that hydrocarbons. Methane's a hydrocarbon, and so is oil, right? Gas and all that shit, naphtha, all the stuff we get out of it. The funny thing is, we get oil a lot deeper than we've ever gotten any fossils. Like a lot deeper, like 30,000 feet deeper than fossils. Like deep sea mining of deep sea exploration of oil is way deeper, which kind of puts a little bit of a crinkle in that whole idea that maybe it's fossil based. It may simply just be based on Earth minerals. And hydrogen hits a carbon, gets connected, and then when it's under pressure, well, it either liquefies and it gets, the chain, the molecule basically continues to grow as chain, right? So it turns from methane into butane into, whatever, into all the way to like C16 fractions. One possibility, I'm not saying it is, just something to keep in mind when you think of fossil fuel. But how did we drill? In the 1800s, we realized, the general we, let's say Rockefeller, that basically you found an oil deposit. And what was an oil deposit? Well, the earth has a lot of pressure and heat. And as this stuff, however it gets made, either by molecules banging together or by dead dinosaurs, this stuff is under pressure. And it's usually together with some gas. And gas under pressure, gas under pressure gets a little bit explosive-y. But liquid under pressure, it doesn't really compress, right? So it just pushes up. So if you just found one of these like really ready to bust kind of deposits close to the surface, you just have to pop a vent. Then it gushered up, right? And it gushered up, and you've seen all the pictures, right? It keeps gushering until eventually the pressure stops. Now, some pressures don't stop for years. For 40 years, they can keep going. So that was the way we basically drilled for oil. Rockefeller made a huge fortune. Not drilling, but just mostly refining. But again, who cares? Tons and tons of oil. America all of a sudden launched the oil revolution. They realized early that maybe oil was before cars and all that shit, but people they were killing whales for lighting lamps, right? So they figured they can at least get a good market out of just replacing whale oil, which is what kerosene was all about. And then eventually they found lots of uses for it, including the car. And then eventually we're left with the spent well. And the well, it still had some oil. It just wasn't under pressure. It wasn't coming up. So some bright spark decided, well, if I throw a hose down there and just crank up some water, oil and water don't mix, maybe I can push the oil up. And sure as hell, they were able to kind of recondition some of their wells. Milk that last few million barrels out of each well. And that, of course, that practice has evolved since the 1800s. You might imagine technology has gotten a bit better, a bit better, a bit better, a bit better. Lots of places in Saudi, lots of places all over the place have understood how to optimally extract as much oil as possible out of that. But then some other bright spark had this idea called fracturing. Now there's a weird thing when you happen to have oil popping up through the ground. If you've got clay or if you've got porous materials, it can keep seeping up and, it gets higher. But sometimes it hits just rock. Shale, for example. Shale formations or packed sand, and then it kind of gets stuck there and trapped. So we often would find that because obviously as a well would get spent, you found that it had a lot of leftover tar sands or a lot of oil embedded into the rock, whatever. So they figure, if I take that same hose and I really crank up the pressure, maybe add some funky chemicals like acids or whatever, get that rock to break up a little bit, then I can flush out. I can kind of basically wash out all the oil and get some more oil. Well, for a while it was kind of a dodgy thing because you created earthquakes and stuff got really weak. But because people kept bitching about it, stuff got better. So now you're using basically very safe chemicals, mostly water and steam. You're using echolocation to find trapped deposits. And you basically fracture the bed, you pressurize it, and off you go to the races. And it happens to have some strange fucking benefits. So shale wells are far smaller than normal wells. Now, what does that mean? Exxon, BP, all those big, ugly globalist companies, they can't be bothered with shale oil. Shale is just, it's thousands of barrels per well, not millions of barrels. So they're looking for the big, deep sea station. They don't have the business model to take care of these kind of things. So as a result, American ingenuity stepped right in, and all of a sudden you've got thousands of oil companies. They're not large companies, they're profitable companies, and they're cranking out oil like you wouldn't believe. Now this oil happens to also be sitting usually together with some natural gas. It's funny, if you've ever seen the picture of the earth lit up at night, there's a few lit up places in the US that ain't electricity. They're permanent flare-offs of natural gas, because for the longest time we used to think of natural gas as a waste product. We'll just burn it off. We want the oil. Well, again, innovation. Some more bright sparks got together and said, why the fuck are we throwing away this natural gas? Because if we actually get a little bit smarter about our technology and get a little bit smarter about also capturing the natural gas, all of a sudden what used to cost us some horrendous amount, like $100 per barrel on this other crap, shale oil, now all of a sudden we can start bringing that cost really down. Not only that, because the oil was trapped in shale, it didn't have a chance to creep up through all of the other mud and all that stuff, so it didn't pick up sulfur, it didn't pick up contaminants. It's not heavy crude, it's sweet crude, light oil. It hardly ever requires, it barely requires distillation, which is really, really nice for the petrochemical industry. Now, all of these, fracking's been around a while, but here's the thing. Back in 2004, we used to just drop a hole, right? We'd send out radar and we'd find out, okay, well there seems to be some trapped oil here. So we'd drop here and then we'd go on directional drilling, drill horizontally, then just start pushing water in here and then suck out all of this oil. 2004. Lots of pipe, one contact. Now, they got really smart about this horizontal drilling. They could go in multiple directions. So all of a sudden, they could go deeper and they could go further. That was by 2011. But here's the thing. Now it kicks into high gear. Because now they realized, well, shit, I can just pour a cement pad. And here, I'm just not going to drop them vertically. I'm just going to drop them at slight angles and go in every which direction and pump them all up to the same thing. Reuse the same fluid that I'm pumping down as I'm done with every layer. So now I can reach multiple deposits. And yet, not to be outdone, they even figured out that, hey, you know what? I can drop one single pad vent and then go out, way out, 7,500 feet. I can go into multiple feeder pipes per single pipe, and on one platform now I can start generating some serious shale oil. Oh, and natural gas, incidentally. And because these very innovative people also realize that, hey, natural gas also needs to be captured here to the degree that they're using it in the fracking process or capturing it directly into pipelines, all of a sudden, we are now sitting on a pile of extra natural gas that we never had before. And I mean a pile. So, to give you an idea, here's when we started, right? 2012, back in the day. So shale was well around 90 per barrel. Now this is like how many barrels you put out versus at the price. So obviously OPEC puts out shitload of barrels, cheap. Russia, not so many shitloads, but cheapish. United States, not so cheap. You know, we tried whenever we drilled, we kept the price out there because, you know, frankly, everybody buys in dollars whenever they buy oil. So we weren't terribly interested in getting the price depressed. But here's the problem. By 2017, United States shale is lower than OPEC. You know, the big deposits that Saudi has that, you know, you just have to pop a vent in and it starts gushing out. Even worse, as of 2019, price is looking like it's going to reach $24. $24 because of the mix of gas economics that we're reclaiming. So functional cost, it's going to be like $24 per barrel to get it out of the ground. That's a big problem. It's a big problem for Russia because all of a sudden their oil, because if United States, thank God we're not necessarily selling it. We could be. We have, as of 2018, stopped importing any. I mean, it's pretty funny to watch, but there's a whole bunch of ships that are literally parked right off our coast on the off chance that there's some interruption in service and we might want to pick up the occasional, you know, million barrels of oil. And we haven't been picking it up because we don't need it. We stopped importing it from everywhere. Not only that, we have all this extra gas and we've got the infrastructure ready to go into Mexico because Mexico had their own oil stuff that they were shipping to here. Didn't have much natural gas, and then because of the cartels, their oil industry kind of collapsed. But the pipelines were there, so now we're able to sell them really, 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 really cheap gas. We're expected to sell them about 15 times more gas over the next 5 years, which is going to create a fucking boom in terms of energy in Mexico. And here's the next thing. Mexico offers cheaper manufacturing labor. We used to export to China, right? That's the rate for China. And that's the rate for Mexico. Why would we fucking go around the world and back again for labor? Have them steal from us, have them do all the rest of the bullshit we've had to put up with? I'm thinking more Mexico jobs are going to come. And they're going to get rich off of shale oil. Not theirs, ours, but they're still going to basically be growing like a motherfucker. And our neighbors to the north, let's, again, same issue as Europe, right? Not growing the right way. However, the one place that has shale, well, they don't have shale, they have sands oil, but similar, is Alberta. And they're younger. And they're the ones that are basically the ones that are outputting anything in their economy. Because guess what? Canada has embraced a whole bunch of socialist programs, right? They've got human rights this and human rights that, and they've been literally paying Quebec to not secede. Quebec has been insistent that they want their independence. And they went so far as to ensure that secession is absolutely legal in Canada. And now, because Vancouver, Ontario, all those places no longer have the cash to kind of keep up the same level of investment in bribing the Quebecois and the rest of the social programs, they've been slowly sticking it to the Albertans. pretty soon Alberta will be required to carry the rest of the Canadian population programs at a tune of an extra $50,000 a year in tax burden. And just let that ruminate. If Canada does more of these dumbass Trudeau things that they've been doing, you might be looking at having to like shell out an extra 50 grand to the state, because the state's got to take care of, transgender music theory or whatever the fuck they're investing in. But secession is legal, right? So you could go independent, but God forbid you could join the states, right? I'm not saying that they would, but I am saying that would solve all their economic issues. At least Alberta's, not the rest of Canada's. So Canada isn't necessarily as great as you might think, because we kind of took back most of the advantage we've been letting them get away with from NAFTA of years past. And their only sole real, booming economy is Alberta. And they're really trying to fuck that over. So yeah, that's where we are. Now, let's look at the US, which was the whole point of this. Not only are we not really that interested in global trade, we really don't depend on it. You see these little lines out? This is the most recent I could find online, but the numbers are actually far lower. And half of so as a country, this would show about 15% of our GDP is tied in trade between export and import. It's actually far less, about 8%. And more than half of that is already being traded to Mexico and Canada. The neighbors, local neighbors. And then the other 4% or something is Asia. So we don't really give a shit if we actually ever close a deal with China if we don't get what we want. Yes, the farmers will get pissed. But guess what? China held off on the soy, and eventually, they had to buy it because we are the source. Brazil has soy too, but they've got a little transportation issue that's a little bit harder to overcome, and not enough supply. So you eventually still have to buy it from us because we're the supplier. And to just make matters worse, China ran into this pig flu issue, and it fucked up most of their pig. Now they need pig like a motherfucker. And guess who's got a lot of it? The Americans. Wouldn't you know it? So here's all the countries that we're way out of whack with in terms of we import a shitload and we export jack shit. That's pretty much everybody. Oh yeah, and just kind of put a last fine point on it. Good old climate change. I mean, I'm not an alarmist, but let's just say, if you were to accept a 10 meter sea level rise, who gets fucked? Might surprise you to understand that not so much the United States. I mean, first of all, if it's 10 meters overnight, yeah, you might have some catastrophic losses, but as it's 10 meters over the course of X years, we start moving inland, we lose South Beach, most definitely. New Orleans, unless, since they haven't invested since Katrina, we're probably going to lose half of New Orleans, right? Or we better get the Army Corps of Engineers to start fucking, rebuilding all the dikes. New York would be threatened, but Manhattan has money, so the seawall that they already have, they could raise another 10 meters. So, yeah, not much of a problem. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, they already know how to deal with that shit, so they're probably not going to get that affected. Alexandria went under once. It'll probably go under again. But here's all these places who are wholly unequipped, well, with the exception of Osaka. But Shanghai, Ningbo, Guangzhou. Guangzhou was like the success story outside of Shenzhen and Shanghai, right? A lot of these places go under. So again, even if climate goes wrong, it still fucks the world more than it fucks us. So here's the world as it's gonna look nowadays. People we give a shit about are us, right? Our immediate allies. Canada's gonna be degraded, not because anybody's attacking them, just because of their own fucked up economy. These are our allies, so we're gonna keep an eye on them, but we're not really gonna jump in because it's Europe now. They're gonna fucking go to town on one another. Italy's going to fold. Majority of the Greece is already folded practically. Ireland's going to fold. Britain will survive, hopefully. Spain will not do so good. France and Germany will, because it's their project after all. The Nordics kept themselves out of the shit for quite a bit. If they survive their issue with migration, they'll be fine. Over yonder, Russia ain't doing so good. China ain't doing so good. India will keep trucking, but until they really get their infrastructure underway, you're going to see the same India you've always seen. Surprisingly, Africa will actually keep developing, keep getting better. Will keep escaping poverty, with very few exceptions, like Mogadishu, Somalia, all those places where Islamic radicals tend to make great party for everybody. Yemen's in trouble because they happen to be the sole Middle Eastern country without oil. One of these guys will eventually knock the other one out, but who knows who will be the first. Syria's fucked. Israel will keep hopping along. Turkey will do well. Australia will do well. Chad will do well. Some parts of South America, but overall, not a bad world. But here's the number one thing in this world: we don't really need to be part of it. We will be, but we don't need to be, and it doesn't hurt us. Most of the population really wants us to get the fuck out of Dodge anyways. They've had it. We've been in Afghanistan forever. We haven't done shit. And as we pull out, as you've just seen, we pulled out of fucking Kurd territory for one hot minute, and they're ready at each other's throats. North America can pretty much raise its walls up and not give a shit. While at the same time recognizing that the U.S. is the largest producer of food in the world. So we'll still be, we'll still have stuff that is highly sought after by the world if we want to even sell it, but we can absorb it locally. But by and large, U.S. participation is going to become transactional, as in, what have you done for me lately? Or what's in it for me? And it isn't because we're assholes, it isn't because we're evil, and it isn't because we're just insulated. And there's nothing in our politics that really gives a shit about what's going on in the world, especially given sort of the general attitude that the world has shown us. So yeah, welcome to the new world.